Hello everyone and welcome. Thank you for joining us. I'm Adrienne Schur. I'm your host for today's webinar, Understanding and Implementing Formative Assessment. This webinar is part of the free Assessment for Learning professional development community on EdWeb. So today we're lucky to have two distinguished speakers, Dr. Eileen Depka, Director of Continuous Improvement and Assessment for the New Berlin, Wisconsin Public Schools, and Samantha Bunting. She's the Vice President of Digital Content for Triumph. We'd like to know who's here today, so click in the little white bullets next to the names just as you're doing, and we'll find out who's here today. Okay, the numbers are racking up. Okay, everybody done clicking the white bullet next to what it is you do? Okay, so it looks like we have about 54% teachers, about 12% administrators, 2% librarians, and 11% support teachers or coaches, and then 19% others. Maybe we'll find out later who the others are. But at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Eileen Depka from New Berlin, Wisconsin, who is the Director of Continuous Education and Assessment. Thank you, Eileen.
Hello everyone. Thank you to EdWeb and to Triumph Learning for sponsoring the webinar today, and thanks to all of you who have joined us for this presentation. As Adrienne said, we're here to talk about understanding and implementing formative assessment. So let's get started. The quote that I want to share with you is one from Dr. Jim Popham, who is a well-known a well-known author in formative assessment, and it's an interesting quote. A formative assessment is a planned process in which assessment elicited evidence of student status is used by teachers to adjust their ongoing instructional procedures or by students to adjust their current learning tactics. Well, that seems to be a mouthful, but if we think about formative assessment as, first of all, a planned process, it's something that we think about and implement for a purpose, and we'll talk more about that today. In which assessment elicited evidence of student status. So we're looking for that input from students to see where they currently are. And then that information is used by teachers to adjust instructional practices. But I think one of the important pieces is it's also used by students to adjust their learning and what they need to do in order to get better at the content and the information that they're learning. Let's get our heads around why we assess. I know that there are many reasons that all of you assess it within your content areas or within your positions. Well, one of those reasons is really to know where students are at that time. What do they know? What are they able to do? How are they able to apply the knowledge and skills that they have? We also want to make sure that we take a look at student performance and we look at the expectations we have. Look at where they are compared to those expectations, and then provide feedback for them so that they know where they are and how to get better. We use assessment to evaluate the practices that we use within our teaching. Did the strategies that we used work? Did the content, the materials, did the resources that we use have a good effect on the students as they were performing or showing us that they could perform? It also helps us recognize those challenge areas, and we can adjust instruction accordingly. What are the areas that the students just are not sure about? They're not performing as well as they are within other areas. And then lastly is to celebrate and learn from the successes that we're experiencing. What are those things that we're doing that have a really good impact on the learning of students? Let's celebrate them along with the students and continue to use the practices that we've learned and expand those practices in other areas so that we can continue to expand our levels of success. So why do we formatively assess? Well, formative assessment really is those ongoing things that we do so that we can adjust instruction to meet student needs on a minute-by-minute basis. What are the things that we want students to know? And at what level do we want them to know them? We assist students in knowing their current status, and we look towards those next steps for achieving a higher level of success. So when we're looking at formative assessment, we want students to be able to show us what they know prior to any kind of summative or formal evaluation so that we can adjust instruction and we can meet their needs in order for them to get the highest levels of learning possible. So one of the things that we also have to think about is how are we going to use those results? As teachers, of course, like I said earlier, we're going to respond to those results. We're going to change our strategies. We're going to provide extra practice, extra instruction. But we also need to remember that students are the key users of those results. If we're looking at how to use those results, one of the questions that we would have students ask themselves is, where am I right now? What do I know? What do I have a great level of confidence that I can perform? Where do I need to be? So in other words, where am I now compared to the targets that I have in front of me? What do I do well? What do I still have questions about? So when I know where I am and I know where I need to be, I know what the gap is, and I can as teacher help students fill that gap, and students can start to evaluate what they need to do in order to get better at get to the next level. What help do I need is a very important question. In some cases, students might be able to get there on their own. They understand their mistakes, they understand how to get better, but for them to actually evaluate, what kind of help do I need from my teacher? What do I need to ask about? What do I need to ensure that I know in order to perform at the next highest level? Sometimes when we think about formative assessment, we think about it as a thing as opposed to a cycle. And from here on out, we're going to talk about formative assessment as a cycle. It's a matter of using a process in order to evaluate student performance. There are 5 steps to that process. The first is to clarify the target. What is it exactly that we want students to know, be able to do, and perform? The second level that we're going to be talking about is determining what kind of format are we going to use for that assessment, what's going to work for us, what's the best match that we have to the content that we're trying to deliver so that students can show us what they know. The third step is to obviously implement the assessment, but then to gather data and evaluate that data during the process. That's a pre-planned step. How are we going to gather the information and then evaluate that information? The fourth step is to look at the strengths and challenges based on data and to make some decisions about where we go next as a result of that data. And then the fifth step is to actually take a look at what if any, kind of plans do I need to make in order to respond to the data, and how do I close the gap? So how do I close the gap from where my students are to where they need to be? Now, throughout the next slides, I'll share with you each step of the way and what we can do, how we can get there to make this a doable option for us in the classroom. We're all very busy, obviously. This becomes a very easy to use, easy to implement process when we get used to some of the steps involved. So the first step, we talked about clarifying the target. Now, most often we start with the standards. some standards are pretty big. They are comprehensive, and in and of themselves are so huge that we need to break them down in order for ourselves to better understand them and our students to understand them. So on this slide I have an example for you of one way we can break down standards. It doesn't matter what content we're talking about. This happens to be an English language arts standard from the Common Core Standards. And it's in the area of reading, but it could be in social studies, it could be in math, it could be in any content area at all where we're working with standards. So if you take a look at the standard that is listed, it says to ask and answer such questions as who, what, when, where, why, and how to demonstrate understanding of key details in the text. That's a mouthful. Let's talk about breaking that down. So we're going to break it down by doing a few different things. Let's actually go on to the next slide. Nope, I'm sorry, we're going to go back to the last slide. What is the standard asking us to do? Well, if we take a look at the verbs in that standard, you'll see ask and answer. It's asking us to do two different things, or more importantly, our students are to ask and answer questions. Well, what type of questions? So first of all, what are we supposed to do, and what are we supposed to do that with? We're supposed to ask questions. We're supposed to ask questions about who, what, when, where, and why. And you can see below how I've listed who, what, when, where, why, and how separately. Why? Because each of those is something that we need to remember to ask students to be able to do. The next thing that we ask is in what context? Is there a special context that we need to be able to have students apply this standard in? Well, they're to demonstrate their understanding of those key details. So in breaking down the standard, we're asking students to solicit understanding of key details by asking questions like who, what, when, where, why, and how. We're also asking them to demonstrate the understanding of those key details. So it's two separate things that we're being asked to do. If we go on to the next slide, I have another example for you from a geometry standard in math. And this one is to identify and describe shapes, and you can see all of the shapes listed. So what are we being asked to do? We're being asked to identify and describe. Identify and describe what? All of the shapes that are listed. So you can see how I've underlined them. Is there a context? And yes, there is within the standard. It says regardless of the orientations of overall size. Now, the reason that we're breaking them down into these parts is when we want to make sure that students understand the entire standard, we want to make sure that we're teaching all of the parts of the standard and eventually assessing all of those parts, whether we do it at the same time or not. After we take a look at the standards or content that we're teaching, we want to determine the format and purpose. How are we going to assess that understanding? So first we've identified the standard or the content. Now the difference between the two, in some cases we have standards that are a little bit more global and don't necessarily identify the content that we'll be using. For example, having students in reading understand or identify who, what, when, where, why. It doesn't say that we have to do that within a certain piece of literature. So the content piece, we might add that piece of literature to it. What book are we using? What magazine, article, what nonfiction text are we using in order to assess? So we would determine that, and then we take a look at what format will be best in order to do that. And then we go ahead and create or identify the assessment. We might be creating it ourselves, or we might be identifying a pre-existing assessment. So what might that look like? I'm going to share with you the step-by-step process of how we start again at that standard. We decide what we're going to assess. So you can see by this slide we've decided to assess whether or not students can identify and describe shapes, including the circles, squares, triangles, and rectangles. And then I've also included regardless of the orientation. We have some decisions to make now with assessment. We can assess in a variety of different ways, including the ones but not limited to those that I have on this slide. So we might decide to use that multiple choice or selected response type piece where we're giving students certain examples. We might be doing an A, B, C, D choice or a 1, 2, 3, 4 choice. We might be doing some true and false questioning. Is it accurate? Is it not? In the true and false, we might actually also have the students explain why something is false or give a little bit more information as to why it's true. We might be giving them a diagram and asking them to label its parts or doing some matching or filling in the blank. If those types of questions don't work or may just be part of the assessment, do we also need to give them the ability to tell us what they know in the form of a constructed response question, perhaps giving them a short task that they're responding to in writing, or maybe an essay. We might be giving them a performance where they're actually applying their knowledge and skills. We might be asking them to do a project or a product or a demonstration of some type. The goal of any assessment, including all of these types listed here and more, is to make sure that students are able to demonstrate their understanding, that they can take the standards that we identified as what they need to know and show us that they can use them in new, unique situations and demonstrate their understanding in a way that we can make decisions from. So while we're planning that assessment, I'm going to get back to showing you an example of an assessment that could be designed for what we just identified, but we might want to use a template similar to the one you now see in the slide in order to design that assessment. We can take a look at what that course is. In this case, I'm showing you an example of single-digit addition assessment. It's from a second grade standard, and students are being asked to show what they know, can do, and apply in the following situations. Now, why know, do, and apply? Know is very factual. It might be, like it says here, some calculations that they're doing. To do something, it might be something beyond that. Given multiple problems, they might have to demonstrate understanding in a variety of ways. Apply takes us possibly to a new and unique situation, maybe a task that they can do in order to show what they know. On this same template, we can also decide how we're going to assess and the variety of assessment types we're going to use. So you'll see in red at the bottom of know, do, and apply that perhaps if I were to design this assessment, I might do some multiple choice for do they know what some means? Do they know some of the vocabulary? Can they identify the correct answer out of some answer choices? The do, I'm going to ask them to do 4 calculations and maybe a short answer or 2 explaining why something is the way it is. And then applying, I might have them do a mini task, giving them a real-world scenario that they have to decide how to calculate the math involved in that real-world scenario, making sure that I'm sticking to the standards that I want to assess. Another thing that I'm going to want to know at this time is, will I need a rubric? I might not. It's there just to remind us that there are other choices for us to use. And then I might also use a color-coded data sheet, and I'll show you that in just a little bit. So getting back to that kindergarten geometry example, what do I want the students to know? Reminders, I want them to know the names of shapes. I want them to be able to, by looking at a shape, tell me what it is. I also then want them to be able to know and identify that shape regardless of the orientation. And then I want them to be able to tell the difference between the shapes and why those shapes exist, or why they're called what they're called, and that's my application. So in numbers 1 through 7, you can see that I'm asking them to do identify shapes with different orientations. In number 8, I'm actually asking them to apply. I am asking them to draw a triangle. Drawing a square, and then in number 9, I'm asking them to do something that's actually not even possible, but it takes it to a new meeting. I'm asking them to draw a square that is not a rectangle. Now, I would only do this if we had talked very much about the different qualities of the shapes and how all squares are rectangles, and that's the answer that I would be expecting here. So I've asked students to not only tell me what they know, I've asked them to apply what they know to some different situations. So step 3, moving on, is we go ahead and we implement that assessment, and then we're going to gather and evaluate some data for the assessment. So collecting and organizing data is something that is extremely important when we're talking about any kind of assessment, including formative, but we don't want to make it impossible for ourselves to do. We want to make it something that's doable, that we can do without a whole lot of effort, and yet we don't want to forget that part because of the importance of being able to evaluate that data, and I'll show you some examples in just a minute. We want to take that data and compare it to what our desired outcome was. So that's where we go back to the template of what is it that we wanted students to show us that they know and can do. And then after we look at that data and analyze it, we go ahead and take a look at, so what are our next steps? Our next steps could be as simple as we're moving on to the next unit, we're moving on to the next day, or we're moving on to maybe a summative assessment because the students seem to be doing really well in what they know. Or it might be we need to do some reteaching on some certain aspects. If we take a look at the next slide, when I talk about doing a very easy use of data, something that is very visual, easy to report, this is an example of that. We have students' names down the left. You'll notice that across the top, I gave an assessment that was very specific to what I wanted students to know. So across the top, you'll see, number 1, I asked them to do something with a square, identify a square, then a triangle, and so on. What I do in this type of data, in this type of data collection, is I assume by the green that all students will get everything correct. Now, is that going to happen? Probably not. But then what I do, whether I'm working with a paper and pencil grade book, whether I'm working with an electronic grade book, or whether I'm working with some other format, I might be working with Excel, I go ahead and I change the color of the incorrect responses. Now, there's a really good reason for doing this. I know when we go through multiple assessments that we have given students, we clearly know which students understood and didn't. But when we do this and collect all of the information on one page, we can evaluate in a very different way. We can evaluate not only for an individual student, but we can evaluate for all of the students together. So if I were looking at this data to analyze it, I can take a look from left to right to see how certain students are doing. So you'll see that student number 6, for example, had some issues with multiple pieces. Perhaps that student was absent, perhaps that student just needs some more time in order to better understand the content. You'll also see by looking down in the columns that we also have an issue here. Number 5 was a problem for students. So we need to take a look and see what is that data telling us. It's in an easy to interpret format, but that doesn't mean, for example, that students don't know what a square is. It could mean that in some cases, not particularly with this test, but it could mean it was a bad question. It could mean it was something that we forgot to address. It could mean that they really just don't understand the concept that's being assessed with question number 5. So we take a look at the data and we decide what to do with it. Moving on to the next step, we need to create and implement plans to close that gap. So what are we going to do? Like we just talked through, or I talked through with you, we're going to go ahead and we're going to analyze that data. We're going to try to close that gap between the expected performance that we had and the performance that the students actually demonstrated. Now, how might we do that? Well, this is where the experts that all of you are come into play. We all know a certain bank of strategies, and we continue to expand our strategies. Do we need to take a look at and do some differentiation for groups of students? Do we maybe need to use a new instructional approach, maybe doing some hands-on things with our students, or trying a new strategy that will teach the content differently? We might, after teaching the content differently or teaching it again, we might have the students, and probably will have the students, do some additional practice to make sure that they have a solid foundation prior to the next time we assess them. If we continue looking at step number 5, there are some things that we just want to remind ourselves of. Things like how will we make sure that we respond to the data? It's easy, I think, well, for me as teacher, it was often easy for me to give the assessment and then look at the data, but the next step of the responding to it is the most important, and it was something that it took me longer to really grasp and move forward with. But I really need to take a look at, if the students don't understand, how will I teach those concepts? If I do the same thing in the same way, it may not have any greater impact than it did the previous time. So what am I going to change? What am I going to do differently? And then most importantly, how will I know that whatever I chose to do to reteach was successful? How do I do that? Well, by planning my next assessment, my either formative or summative assessment. How am I going to assess the fact that the students actually did understand and were able to apply that new knowledge? The assessment that we just saw showed again that the students were confused by the orientation of the square. When the square was changed to the side, they weren't quite sure what it was. It was more of a diamond shape. So what will we do? We might do some practicing with the orientation. We might cut out some shapes and shift those shapes around. Again, that's where teachers are absolutely experts on the types of things to do. At this time, I also like the phone a friend aspect. Obviously, we all know teachers who teach the same grade level. Some of them teach the same content. It might be in our own school. It might be in a neighboring district. But to say, how did you teach that? And what kind of results did you get on the assessment that you did? How could I teach this in a different way so that my students better understand it? So then I go ahead and I take a look and say, okay, I'm going to try that too. And we'll look for the results on the next assessment. We went through the 5 steps. I want to share with you another example. We'll go through it again, this time with an English language arts example. So, step 1, again, we were clarifying the target. This is the example that you saw earlier, where the students are being asked to ask and answer a variety of questions. So here I need to decide, how am I going to assess it, or more importantly, first of all, what am I going to assess? Assessing all of that information on one formative assessment could be done, but it is very complex and it's much more difficult to tell what the students can and cannot do. In formative assessment, if we can do small chunks at a time and we can continuously formatively assess, we're more likely to be able to pinpoint areas that the students are having difficulty, so we can respond to that difficulty with much more assurance that we're hitting the right levels of confusion and we're getting that confusion cleared up. As we take a look, what we've decided to do here is assess the student understanding of key details of what and how. And then we're going to ask students to demonstrate their understanding of those key details. So let's take a look at what we might do for the assessment. At this point, I might have also filled out the template that you saw earlier. What do I want my students to know, do, and apply, and how will I assess it? Well, in this case, I've decided to assess it with 2 questions with multiple parts. Whatever the story is, whatever it is they're reading, again, whether it's newspaper, nonfiction, short story, novel, I might ask them to name 2 main characters of the story and provide 5 key pieces of information about each of the characters. So more of a short answer question. What might I also do then? Choose one of those characters and share a key decision that they made in the story. Explain why this decision was key and highlight how it impacted the story. So I'm doing a different kind of assessment here. This is one where I want to make very sure that up front the students understand what it is that I'm asking them to do. That's true, of course, with any kind of assessment. Are we sure that our directions are clear? Are we sure that students have a good knowledge and understanding of what they're being asked to do within the assessment? Are we sure that the types of questions that we're asking really match the purpose of why we're assessing? So I want to consider those things prior to giving the assessment. In the case of this, I would want to make sure that the students understand those expectations in order to produce a higher quality. This is one where for example, if I want my responses written in complete sentences, I should be saying that to the students. If the clear, well-explained details from the story should be included to justify all of their responses, I want that information back from what they read, clear examples. I want to understand the reasoning and to know more about the character, their actions, because of the answers that they have. Now, this is a case where I would likely be using a rubric. What does quality look like? My rubric would have quality indicators on showing the expectations that I would want for this type of response. If I do these kinds of assessments over and over again, I can create what's called a generic rubric that can be used that explains what high quality responses look like. No matter when I'm giving a constructed response answer, I can expect those types of pieces to be shared with students. The criterion that I want, I need to be upfront about. One of the best reasons for that is because I want to know what's in the student's head. My assessment is to pull out of their brain everything that they know about it. So I don't want to trip them up in format in any way at all. I want to make sure that they're understanding exactly the expectation, so that if there is an error at all, it's an error as a result of content, not as a result of not being clear on how I'm teaching it. Another example of data then, if we go ahead and take a look at this example data, I can see that in this case I've used the same type of information. Again, some of you may be using computer-generated tests, and there are very often graphs available for you. A variety of different ways to report that information are available because it's computer-generated. On our own, we need to find ways that work best for us. If I were using a rubric, this red and green portions of the template might be filled with a 1, 2, 3, 4, for example, if it was a 4-point rubric. So that I can see not only were the answers correct or not correct, but the level of the application of students. Were they at a 4 as opposed to a 3 as opposed to a 2, for example. If I'm just interested in right or wrong, acceptable or not acceptable, the color coding works very well. So I can take a look at this and I can see, boy, the students, when I look from left to right, there was no one student that had more problems than other students. If I look going down the column again, I can see how my class did. And my class had difficulty answering the understanding details portion of this assessment. So then what do I need to do? I need to go back again, evaluate what it is that I want them to know and be able to do, find out where the errors were, and decide on those next steps. What am I going to do in order to create a learning environment where they're able to demonstrate their understanding on this data at a higher level? I want to mention again that the reason that it's so important to have some kind of a mechanism to evaluate data on those columns, it's so that I don't miss, when I look at individual assignments, again, I know how those individual students do, but I want to know how my group does as a whole. What do they do? What are their strengths? What are their challenges? The color coding is so easy to use, and yet it's so visually informative. So when we look at then that step, that closing the gap step, that step number 5, what do we do in all situations? This is so important. I know that as teachers we are going to analyze the data. We're going to create plans to meet the needs of our students, and we're going to carry out those plans because it is what we need to do in order for the students to better understand the standards that we're teaching and the content. However, we also can't forget about the students, because the students are the key users of that information. Now, what does this take? It really takes a matter of forethought and giving the students the time to reflect on what they did on the assessment. This can happen with both formative assessments and summative assessments. Doing think-alouds with students is very helpful in this situation. Again, no matter what the grade level, it could be kindergarten through college. It doesn't matter, pre-kindergarten through college. By think-alouds, I mean if I responded in this way on this assessment and I needed to get better at this, I might be thinking that these 3 steps would be good for me to take next. So practicing think-alouds with students on helping them understand this is where I am, this is where I need to be, and this is how I close the gap. Might also have them do some self-reflecting, taking a look at what they were asked to do on the assessment and then what they actually did to see up front, can they make a change to what they did in order to really demonstrate their understanding. Did they perhaps miss a point, that it was just a matter of a slip up and they really did understand the information? Or are they confused and they need more help? Can we do some goal setting with students to, again, help them realize where they are and what they need to do in order to get better at demonstrating their knowledge and understanding? Another piece that's very easy to do with students on any kind of assessment that's giving is ask them what their next steps will be in their own learning. So what will they do in order to increase their understanding? And then the second step to that is what help do they need? So as student, what do I do or what will I do to increase my understanding? And what help do I need from you as the teacher? There are a variety of assessment tools that we can use. This is a list of just some of them. I wanted to share them with you to show that with the step process, with using formative assessment, it can be in so many different formats. Formative assessment, by the way, can also be used when you're ready to summatively assess the students. You don't necessarily need to create an entirely different assessment, especially on those application of knowledge and understanding pieces. So just to highlight a few of these, some of these are more formal in nature, like a quiz or a short response or a selected response item. It could be a conversation. Some of those pieces that we talked about before. We all know, for example, that teaching a partner is a very powerful way to have students learn and understand, because it's through teaching something that we get a deeper understanding of the concepts than we would have had simply trying to demonstrate them. You can see the variety of pieces here. I think computerized tools, there are so many excellent computerized tools that give us assessment formats, and many of us use them. Looking at storyboards, looking at graphic organizers. Graphic organizers are great assessment tools. Things like KWL, what do you know, what do you want to know, what did you learn? The pieces with the graphic organizers, the wonderful thing about them is they are a blank template that allows us to give it to students to say, tell me what's in your head, show me what you know. It's a blank slate where they can give you all of the information and all of the understanding that they have without the parameters that we've set. There are a few on here. I'm seeing questions about, for example, FIST to 5. I'm going to go through just a few of those right now. Those are some simple, on the spur of the moment, formative assessment tools that we can use. And if we use them on a regular basis, they give us information for the students that will help us monitor the effectiveness of our teaching on an ongoing basis. FIST to 5, for example, is one where we simply ask the students to raise a fist up to 5 fingers, showing how much they currently understand what it is that we're teaching them. So if they are totally confident in what we have just demonstrated and they're ready to move forward with some practice, they're going to have 5 fingers raised. If they are very unsure, they might have a fist, they might have a 1 or a 2. Now in some cases, I know that we might think, well, students don't want to necessarily do that because they might be being looked at by other students. What are they going to say about me if I raise the fist and show that I don't really understand? An effective way to do a FIST to 5 is have the students to do that right in front of their chest so that no one else in the room but you can see what they're doing with that FIST to 5. Red, yellow, green is great for working in groups or independently. Some people do this with cups. Some people just do it with colored construction paper, where if a group of students is working, for example, on a task that you've given them to do, they have a red, a yellow, and a green circle on in their group, on their desk. And what they do is, if they are doing really well, they are good to go. That circle, that green circle is up. That means we are doing really well. Leave us alone. If you want to eavesdrop on us, that's great, but we're doing well. Yellow means keep an eye on us because we're starting to slip. We're getting a little bit confused. Red means that if you don't come over here right now, we have to stop because we don't get it. So that's another formative tool that can be used. Exit slips are often 1, 2, 3 questions that are used at the end of a class period. So for example, I might ask the student, what is the key idea that you learned today, and what is one question that you have? Or what is the most important thing you learned today, and how does it connect to what we learned yesterday? Those could be on index cards, it could be on a small sheet of paper, it could be done through email, it could be done in any way that you want. You collect those, look through them, and you can respond by changing the instruction the next day around what it is that the students need to know. There are plenty of other pieces on there, lots of other things that you can use for those quick little formative assessment pieces as well. So I'd like to go to a wrap-up review slide now before we turn this over to our next presenter. And again, we talked about a 5-step process, clarifying the target. Clarifying the target typically means understanding the standards that we're trying to assess and the content. So taking a look, breaking down the standard in such a way that it's understandable to both us and to the students, and then also looking at the content in which that standard is taught. The second step then is to take a look at what kind of format are we going to use to build that assessment. Are we going to do some short response items? Are we going to do some selected response? What type of format makes sense for what it is that we're asking the students to perform? Then we take a look at, we implement the assessment, and we take a look at the data. Either color coding it, putting into an Excel spreadsheet, putting it into a grade book, but looking at it from 2 points of view. One is individual students, how did the individuals do? And the other is, how did the group do as a whole? Because that helps us to respond most effectively to the data that we're looking at. Then we take a look at examining those strengths and challenges based on the data. What are the students really strong at? What do they need help with? Those strengths, can we tie them to specific strategies so that we make sure that we repeat those, that we make sure that we expand our use of those, and then we look at the challenge areas and respond to them. Step number 5, we go ahead and create and implement that plan. What is that plan going to be? It might be doing some mini lessons with small groups. It might be reteaching something to the entire group and giving them some more practice opportunities so that we make sure that they know and can understand what it is that we ask them to do. At this point in time, I would like to turn it over to Samantha Bunting. Thank you for attending again, and there will be opportunity for questions later on.
Hello everybody, my name is Samantha Bunting. I am the Vice President of Digital Content for Triumph Learning. I'm here to talk to you about how this formative assessment cycle can work in a digital program through the lens of our program that is coming out this week called Waggle. So let's dive in. Waggle is a smart practice system for both math and ELA in grades 3 through 8, but it has content outside grades 3 through 8 as well. I'll show you more as we dig in. So this is pretty much the only slide I'm just going to read you, but this is our philosophy. We wanted to create a practice space where in-the-moment instruction meets personalized pathways to build confidence through productive struggle and to accelerate student achievement. So in-the-moment instruction is really where we get into this formative assessment space. So lots of programs have, especially on the digital side, have spaces where you can assess, spaces where you can instruct, where we can practice and check for understanding, and then a reteaching or reinforcement space. But these steps are kind of isolated student to student. In Waggle, we wanted all of this to happen simultaneously for each student, depending on their needs. So as we assess each student's ability to perform on a specific skill, some procedural understanding, if we notice that there's a weakness, we come in with some additional practice and instruction and a retest for understanding and report all of that data back to you. It's truly personalized in that every student has their own path. So adaptive is a really big buzzword in ed tech right now, and it can mean lots of different things. Instead of saying, you got that right, I'm going to ask you a harder question, we kind of find a pathway that works best for every student. So if a student is struggling, there might be 4 or 5 paths to a prerequisite or in a piece of instruction that they might need. And we work with a partner called Newton that helps us assess these connections and make sure that they're on the strongest path towards content acquisition and knowledge acquisition. Our approach to productive struggle is that we want students to experience it. We want students to fall off the bike and then get back up right away. So we try to create a space where it's safe and engaging and they have a permission to fail. So there's no real detriment to getting things wrong. In fact, actually, students are rewarded for struggling more with the content. So what does this look like? So the Waggle world for a student is organized into assignments, which we call goals. Now, each of these goals is essentially a broken down standard for your instruction. So we talk about clarifying targets in the formative assessment cycle. What does the standard really ask us to do? So we've broken down each of these standards into a set of skills that are isolated micro events that we want to test for each student's ability. So do they know it? Can they do it? Can they apply it on a small level so that the formative assessment can actually produce results? So each of these circles that you see on the screen is a set of skills that the student is working on towards a target, like decimals to the thousandths or understanding volume. In each of these assignments, now these can be multiple assignments. They could be a set of items, we could have a game, it could also be an actual summative assessment or a benchmark assessment, or it can be a lesson or activity that you can do with your class. So there are several different formats for this, and you can choose that format for your students. But instead, we also have the ability to provide them with activities based on the content. So if we know that the best way to formatively assess this is with a graphic organizer that students drag and drop in, this is what we're going to choose to use for the student. If there are several ways to do this, we're going to throw all of those ways back at the student to make sure that they completely understand how to do this in, let's say, all the different ways like Webb's depth and Bloom's. In addition, we have hints and feedback for each student that's unique to every action that they take. So as we're implementing this type of assessment, let's say we want to know how students understand how to read thermometers. Triumph has designed these assessments with a set of hints that are not steps to solve the problem. It's almost as if you have a tutor over your shoulder and they're asking you a question. I believe there's a hint on the previous page. Yeah, think about this a different way. What do you know about this word? What do we know about thermometers? So they more push a student to jar some kind of understanding to help them go. In addition, once they make an answer, once they submit an answer, we have custom feedback that are unique to each answer. So if you picked a certain thermometer in this list, I might be able to say to you, you might have noticed that this was 5 inches away from this and not 5 inches away from that. I can actually respond to the student based on their choice in the program, so that I'm constantly trying to assess what the student knows and give them what they need when they need it. So I don't have to wait to see what the results are to actually interact with the student. So the digital program does this on its own. All students are different. And the beauty of doing this in a digital environment is that it can be pre-programmed with all of these responses to kind of be the first line of attack before you need to intervene. Now, that isn't to say that you won't have to. This is a true blended learning environment. So in our environment, we want to show you more than just a score. It's more important to me that it took, let's say, Sam 5 hours to do this assignment. She accessed 22 hints. She got incorrect feedback for majority of those items, and she's scoring a proficiency of about basic, than to just know that she has a basic understanding. So we strive to show the teachers that use our program as much data as possible to help understand if their assessment worked. So here, when we decide to make an assignment, we have to pick our target. What do I want to focus on? We have these goal maps in our system that show how all of the targets are connected. So each target, you can see prerequisites, all of the things that build to this topic, and the postrequisites. And I can assign for a certain group of students one pathway and really isolate it to provide that for another student. So I can design these formative assessments differently for every student in my class and know that each student will have access to the hints and the feedback, and I'll get data on all of that information. Once I've assigned one of these assignments, I can look at the data in so many ways. And I don't have to wait for the assignment to be over, because as Dr. Depka said, we want to adjust our instruction minute by minute, right? We want to be able to gather this data right before I teach, gather the data in the middle of instruction so that I can start changing my style for certain groups, etc. So I can do these overlays over the goals and say, where are my students struggling? What is the trend of that struggle? Is it going up or is it going down? Where is proficiency being met so I don't need to waste any more class time on it? Additionally, how much effort and grit is being expelled into certain goals so that I can reward the success of this hard work and the resilience that the students are demonstrating. Now that's more of a heartbeat kind of where are we right now? It's Sunday right before instruction and I need to know where my students are. But we can also evaluate data in very, very much depth. So, in very much depth is probably not grammatically correct, but you'll stick with me. We can look at every student, we can look at every assignment, we can slice the data any way we'd like. Right now we're looking at a screen where we're looking at one student's performance over several assignments, and I can flip the script and look at the assignment itself and look at multiple students. I can see their activity, where their proficiency is lying and not lying, and I can also look at the estimated pace to completion. So they might not be proficient right now. However, I can tell the system is letting me know that if I can let them have until their due date, the system is projecting that they will be proficient at that time. Of course, there might be students that are struggling in a way that they need an intervention. So I can see that I have 8 students to watch that are struggling, and I could go in and see what exactly they're struggling with, how they compare to the class or the school average in proficiency and effort, what exact skills they need help on. And in addition, as Adrian pointed out, Triumph Learning is a host of wonderful content out there that's been respected out there for years now. We've also tied all of that content to the Waggle system. So I can go in and see that my students are stuck on a particular skill, and I want to assign them some content from the coach library that we have digitally inside the program. Or I might have those coach books on my shelf, but I need to know exactly where to go, right? I have an issue with, let's say, adding decimals for a bunch of my students. What exactly do they need? I can look into the skill that they need, and then I can choose a lesson based on that skill. So I get a predefined list of all of the things I can do to implement and close this gap, if the implementation of the gap closing hasn't already been handled by the system itself. So the system is incredibly robust to handle all sorts of things that the student might choose to do, and it does it in a very minute way so that you can assess all the strengths and weaknesses of your students minute by minute in the classroom. So this is Waggle. It is launching on the 31st. Fingers crossed. Thursday. This Thursday, it's going to be live and active in a bunch of schools across the country. And if you have any questions that aren't answered in the Q&A, feel free to email me or go to triumphlearning.com and you can check out a free demo of the program. We're working with teachers across the country to help us create this product, and we're very excited to see how it works. It is only math in ELA. I just saw that question for now. Thank you. I think we're going to have Dr. Depka come back on, and we're going to open it up for questions and answers. Hi.
Hi.
So I think if you type in your questions, hopefully one of us will have the answer.
Okay, so I'm seeing the question on changing what's a typical time frame for assessment to be made and planning changed based on the assessment. Can assessment be done and teaching plan adjusted within a 45-minute time period? Actually, absolutely, especially with the shorter pieces that are designed to maybe give students a 10-minute quick opportunity to demonstrate understanding, flipping through those assessments and then adjusting instruction. Things like FIST to 5, like whiteboard answers, like the red, green, and yellow, those can be done consistently throughout a period where instruction is adjusted according to meet the needs of the students immediately. It really depends on the type of formative assessment that you're using and the type of data that you're going to display. Certainly, if something is done at the end of period, that adjustment would be made by the next day, but during the period is absolutely possible as well. Tools for developing good rubrics. There are actually doing an internet search on rubrics. You'll find a few different sites that do tools. Rubistar is one of them. I'm drawing a blank on some of the others right now. But again, if you do a rubric search on the internet, what you can do is be as specific as you can with the content, and then evaluate that rubric for how well it's written and how much it meets your needs for your standards. Oh, good point. Thank you. Do you only do one assessment at a time, or could that could take a long time with multiple standards? It depends on what you want to do. Typically, a summative assessment will summarize multiple standards within the same assessment. The trick with formative assessment is to keep it pinpointed to specific information so that you can tell what the students know and don't know about those things that are currently being taught. So you might not have as many standards, but can you assess multiple standards at one time? Absolutely you can. Is there a specific program used to create data? Probably the one that we are most used to is the Microsoft product Excel. Could be used to create data. There are a lot of different assessment programs available for purchase that you can use. I think that color coding a Word document or a grade sheet is also possible. There are also multiple grade books that give very specific data as you put in information into a grade book.